G'day folks, I'm looking forward today to having a chat with Sam Conaway, the President of US Cardiology Sales at Boston Scientific and Chairman of Close the Gap. Sam has had an incredible life journey from humble beginnings as a hospital laundry room employee to a senior leader in one of the biggest medical technology companies today. He was always the top performer at whatever company he was with and has helped change the paradigm of care in cardiology due to his dedication to leading the sale of new technologies ranging from atherectomy to implantable defibrillators to heart valves and more. Along the way, he has chosen to give back to the patient community and is passionate about his efforts as chairman of Close the Gap, an initiative he started at Boston Scientific, but which has spread across the industry to raise awareness about health inequities and outcomes experienced by people of color. Not only to raise awareness, but to do something about creating better access to care. He's been recognized and lauded for his efforts. And now we have the privilege of learning about what makes Sam who he is today, what drove him to succeed, who his mentors were along the way, and why he is so passionate about giving back. Welcome, Sam. Thanks very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Andrew.
I think what we're trying to accomplish today is to learn more about you, the person behind the success.
All right.
So let's kick off with, tell us about your early life. Where did you grow up? Tell us a bit more about your family.
Yeah. So I grew up in Baltimore, which, as you know, is a very interesting place, really a blue-collar town, and born in 1964, so a while back. Really not that old, but
No, yeah, clearly.
But it was a time when civil rights was at probably a peak, and my parents were just great people. My dad was a laborer who worked for Domino Sugar, drove a cab, actually worked in a liquor store, so he always had 3 jobs, hard work, and I think that's where I got my work ethic from. And my mom was an amazing lady who was a gospel singer, actually, and I remember being with her all the time, going to churches all over Baltimore singing. And interesting enough, she was an amazing orator. She always opened up the singing session, and she obviously was very spiritual, but just got the scene started for a wonderful gospel concert. And so I think that's where I got my love to speak to a group and engage and all that stuff. So Baltimore was a great life. Had a brother and sister, older sister, younger brother. Actually, my brother and I are 11 years apart. So I was wondering how that happened when it did with my parents, because I knew about the deal. But we grew up poor, right? In relative terms, we weren't middle class. We lived in a pretty rough neighborhood. There was a lot of drugs, a lot of crime, and not so good people in that area. But Baltimore was that place back then, and unfortunately, it's kind of that place today.
So you spoke about your mom and dad, and very clearly they have had an impact on you. Who were your biggest influences?
Yeah, so I would definitely say my mom and dad were big influences, because when you're growing up in an environment like that, you don't understand whether you're poor or whether you're underclass. I had a great home, a great home life. My parents loved each other. I saw that love. My father was very strict and made sure that we were doing always the right thing. My mother the same way. And so when I went outside the doors of my home, I had these standards, and it did allow me to kind of usurp some of the challenges that you would have if you didn't have parents. For instance, in an underserved neighborhood, you would probably find yourself accepting that peer pressure more because you didn't have that fear, if you will. I feared my father, quite frankly. So, I think they had a big influence on me and the environment that they developed for my sister, my brother, and I.
Any particular memories of the time of memorable experiences?
Yeah, we had a lot of experiences. I mean, when you grow up in a neighborhood like that, there's a lot of strife, a lot of families breaking up. And I remember my father always saying that we have to stick together. No matter what we face, we have to stick together, because we're going to have trials and tribulations. He lost his job a couple times, and we faced some challenging times with money and all those things. And it was always, let's just stay together, and we did that. And in any household, you have turbulence with family members, right? We always had the uncle that was, did something crazy or came over, but we always stuck together. I do remember Christmas time. And the reason I want to bring it up is because it was an interesting time for us. My father would do whatever it took to get the money together so we could have a beautiful Christmas. And if that means he was out 3 days gambling to win some money, or he had to work and drive the cab all night, or work in that liquor store, he did whatever it takes. And that Christmas time was always special in the Conaway home. And that love you just felt. And I think it was really genuinely my North Star, or my way of always realizing that family's first.
Sports looks like it played a key role in the early years.
Yeah, so sports was my savior, quite frankly. It's interesting, when you were a sports person back in those days, you were kind of given a pass, if you will, because the people who were doing these very bad things, they didn't really have to push you to engage. You didn't have that peer pressure. And it was always, well, Sam's a baseball player, so he doesn't need to help us rob a store or do something really bad, or steal a car, because he's going to be a baseball player. And quite frankly, it gave me a pass to not have that peer pressure, and was really one of my saviors for kind of getting out of that environment. So, one of the things I want to articulate is that, that baseball career was very, very important to me, because it taught me how to compete, and how to make sure that I'm prepared for life. And I also had a lot of buddies, right, that were doing really bad things, using drugs, and unfortunately doing a lot of crime. And that baseball thing kept me out of that. And I can just remember being in friends' houses and watching them kind of destroy their life. And the baseball component, again, kept me grounded and kept me, knowing that I was better than that, and I had something to look forward to. But when I reached 17, unfortunately, I tore my rotator cuff. And it was a devastating thing for me, because I really thought that I would get out of the hood, if you will, with that talent, and just found myself in a position where I just couldn't throw the baseball like I could. And I got cut from the team, and things just kind of start going downhill. And actually, we had moved out of that neighborhood, and I found myself going back because my friends were there. And the people who, I just grew up with, and I just needed to be with them at that time. And I probably did some things that I'm not very proud of at that time, but it was a setback for me. And, I had to kind of break through that, and going to Washington to work in the laundry of the hospital center really helped me get through that.
So tell us more about that experience.
Yeah.
So I have to, before you tell us, I have to tell you this. I didn't learn about this through the research that was done for this discussion. I heard this story like 2 decades ago.
Really? Wow.
Yep. That you were a role model to a lot of the rest of us.
Oh, wow.
So I'll tell the story for the folks listening.
Yeah. So, found myself in that laundry at the hospital center. And an interesting thing, the things that I learned back living in the neighborhood were absolutely applicable to that, because all the folks that were working in that laundry room, not all of them, but the majority of them were ex-convicts. They were drug abusers. They were people who were kind of from my neighborhood, if you will, and probably the adults that my friends had turned into. And so I almost was like, oh my gosh, how did I end up again in this scenario with all of these bad things happening? Maybe I'm supposed to be in this life. I thought that at one time. They were dealing drugs, and maybe I need to get they're doing things that I'm not doing, and you want money, and working in the laundry, you certainly didn't have enough money. But I was a tender age of 18 years old, not knowing what I wanted to do, kind of lost my dream, if you will, with baseball, and was trying to find that next big thing for myself. And there were some dark moments there because you kind of get, in that environment, and you want to survive and you want people to accept you, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And so I used to take the laundry up to the cardiac cath lab, up to the heart station, and to the nuclear lab. And I was always on time, put the lab coats in the right slot for the physicians. And one of the techs and one of the physicians said, "What is a nice kid like you doing working in the laundry?" Because prior to that, they saw ex-convicts. They saw people that weren't on time. And, they had a lot of, they come up to the cath lab and steal things and, that kind of thing from the laundry. So they had this perception, if you will, of the laundry worker, and I didn't fit that perception or that profile. And one of the physicians, whose name's Augusto Pichard, who's a famous cardiologist, and one of the technicians, Hurl Hanna, who unfortunately is not with us anymore, asked me to become an orderly in the cardiac cath lab. And that's where my career started.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Okay. And so I became an orderly for the heart station and the cardiac cath lab, transporting patients. And it was very fascinating to me that I could be in that environment where they were doing, in my mind, surgery at that time,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a transition from surgery to minimally invasive techniques for the cardiac cath lab and the echo lab and nuclear, and I was fascinated by it. And so I was listening to the technicians as they talked to the patients. I kind of got a couple books that I took and started reading, and I started transporting the patients, and when the patients showed up in the different labs, they knew about the procedure. And so the doctors and the technicians were like, "How do you know about the procedure?" And they said, "Oh, that guy." "What do you mean, Sam taught you that? He's the orderly." And so I got noticed. And literally at 19 years old, I was asked and allowed to go into their cardiovascular school, to the School of Nursing, from an orderly. And most of the people who went through that school were either, college graduates, or at least they held an associate's degree. And I had nothing at that time. And it really was the change of my life.
So let's go back one bit, and then we'll come to that one, which is why? Why did you tell them? Why did you feel the desire to inform them as you were leading them into the room?
Yeah.
What was it?
It was, I don't know. I guess I was impressed, not impressed, but I was passionate about learning, even though I wasn't the best student. But I was passionate about this particular learning because my very special uncle died from a heart attack, and he was an air traffic controller, and he was just like the one who kind of escaped, and he lived in an upper class neighborhood, and we would go to his house, and everything was different. The food was different, the atmosphere was different, we dressed differently. And I remember him dying from a massive heart attack, and he was just gone like a light. And I had done my senior project in high school on air traffic controller. And so being in that environment, remembering that about my uncle, I think it gave me the passion to kind of learn about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then it just came to me very easily. Like I learned how to read EKGs on my own, literally from the Gail Walraven book on EKGs. I did that myself. And then it just, it allowed me to talk to the patients in a different way and separate myself apart from the other orderlies that I saw that were just kind of hanging around smoking marijuana all the time.
Just want to dig a little bit more into that. Again, it's desire, or you were driven to learn, constantly curious.
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, very fair to say. And I think, now as a professional adult, very passionate, and I call it entrepreneurial learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell my team, don't wait for someone to educate you on a topic, or if we are introducing something new, spend time on your own, like learning and reading and investigating it. Because when you spend that quality time and that private time to learn something, more than likely you're going to do a better job and learn it. So I really believe in entrepreneurial learning, and I've kind of practiced that ever since then.
And then that drive too. I still think that little bit extra to help. Were you trying to make the patients feel more comfortable? or it was just communicating the knowledge you had? What was
Yeah.
the rationale for?
Yeah. I think it was probably both, to be honest with you. It was gratifying to see these elderly patients, show up more knowledgeable and capable of having a discussion with the technician because they knew what was about to happen to them. And then once I saw that courage from patients and them showing up, it was a pleasure for me to get them educated,
Yeah.
And then, over time, you just became, it was almost expected of me. And it was interesting, the technicians literally stopped explaining the procedure because they knew the patients would show up educated from Sam. And that gave me a ton of gratification.
All right. So then you got into school, into class.
Yeah. So I get into the SAVOY Tech program, and that competitiveness, that sports, that wanting to be at the top of my class, I knew it was an anomaly for me to even be there, particularly as an African American, particularly as an 18-and-a-half-year-old young man, and a person who hadn't accomplished much from an educational standpoint. So I knew I had to really buckle down. But I will tell you, it was the kind of thing where it was patient care, taking care of people that I think I saw from my mom.
Yep.
As a spiritual person in the church, we were always doing food drives. We were always doing things. We didn't have much, but we were always giving back. And I think that really allowed me to excel, if you will, because I knew I was taking care of patients, because it was didactic, but yet it was a lot of practical experience, and being in the cath lab, the heart station, the echo lab, and doing as you were learning. And for me, that's the way I like to learn. So I ended up graduating actually the top of my class, which was really cool.
So it is, just thinking back to the conversation about your parents, work ethic,
Yes.
drive from your dad,
Yep.
communication skills from your mom, the entrepreneur probably from both.
That's right.
And so that, to me, when we'll go through all the way through your career, but that is that sort of sums up you to me, which is a remarkable communicator, very self-driven, strong work ethic. Yep.
Yeah, no question about it. Yeah.
Done. We can finish.
Okay.
All right. So you've got through the course, number one.
Yep.
Then what happened? What was next?
So, I think when you put your best foot forward, you stand out, you get noticed, right? And I always say that, people can give you an opportunity, but if you don't take that opportunity and run with it, then you've missed really a chance to excel in life. And I saw that very early on, that I could do things in that particular arena where I could excel. And the reason why I say that is because when I started doing procedures, these things came very easy to me in terms of being facile with entering the artery with needles and cutting down vessels and understanding the different tools. I mean, literally, someone could say something, 014 wire, 018 wire, put over this, whatever. And it just popped in my brain, and I could visually see it, and it became easy for me to do and understand. And what was a really gratifying thing was to have a physician show up in the cardiac cath lab, and he says, "Okay, Sam's scrubbing with me today. Sam, get everything done to the LV gram, and then I'll come in." I mean, can you imagine?
I was going to say, how'd that make you feel?
Oh my God, the gratification, was amazing. Having a pager and being responsible at 19 years old, 20 years old, carrying a pager to get called in for a STEMI, when someone was dying, literally dying in your hands, putting a balloon pump in, doing all these things to save lives. I mean, it was just incredible. And I remember so vividly me showing up with the pager, and my father's like, "Oh, you're selling drugs?" And I'm like, "No, this is a hospital pager." So he just got like a thing on the top, and I'm getting paged by the hospital. But he was joking with me, but in a serious way. How did you get here? How did you get here, Sam? I mean, you didn't go to medical school. And I'm coming home telling him about these invasive procedures that I'm doing on patients. And it was just really, really, really gratifying. And it took me to another level in terms of my confidence as a person, as someone in a world where, you know, in 1983, 84, 85, 86, you know, it was still very challenging to be African American and excel,
Sure.
particularly in a hospital setting. There wasn't a lot of us around.
How'd your mum feel?
Oh gosh, she had a ton of gratitude. She'd tell her friends about me, and they're like, "Is he a doctor?" She's like, "No, he's not a doctor. He's a technician." Well, what is a technician? You know, and you know, interestingly enough, at Washington Hospital Center, back in those days, Augusto Pritchard, he would seek out people from different parts of the hospital because he knew that if he gave them a shot, they would work out and have a strong work ethic. And he had an insatiable eye for talent. And we started getting more people after me from the laundry. We started getting more people from environmental services. We started getting more people from the cafeteria. As a matter of fact, one of my good friends who works for me today, his name is Ian Ransamy. We were roommates and he came from the cafeteria and I got him into it. And literally the TCT, when you looked at TCT, if you look back at some of the old films, that entire cath lab was filled with a lot of African Americans. And that's because we paved the way for that.
So how many more years were you at the hospital center?
Oh yeah. So in the cath lab, you know, you just doing so many different things and just happened to be there a special time because the innovation for the cardiac cath lab was happening. I remember working with Myla Sturzler. I remember working with John Simpson. I remember Andreas Grunzig came to the lab. I remember, you know, Jeff Hartzler coming to the lab. So I'm not really understanding the magnitude of these icons coming in to work with Washington Hospital Center because we were a special place. We did probably the most volume. And Augusto was building this empire and we had Marty Leon coming and Kenny Kent, all these icons in the space. And I was sitting right in the middle of it, you know, not really understanding it, but realizing that this is a pretty special place. And I remember I was doing a case and John Simpson was there and some others were there and they thought I was a fellow. And kind of commented, well, when you finish your fellowship, you know, and I was like, no, I'm not a fellow, I'm a technologist. And back then, there wasn't a lot of people who transitioned from the cardiac cath lab to industry. But John was bringing in a pretty unique device called directional atherectomy. And they needed people who had strong clinical confidence. And this wonderful person named Melanie Bilazarian, who was working for the company at the time, had kind of recruited me. And John had seen me and others had seen me. Paul Buckman had seen me. Alan Will eventually saw me because I ended up getting my first job, you know, with that company. And it was just an amazing experience. But I actually started working for Mellencrot as a per diem. So I was still coming back to the cath lab. So I kind of had two jobs, if you will. But I wasn't sure I would make it in the industry. So I made sure I kept my skills in the cath lab. So I was kind of working both jobs at the same time.
Yeah, you didn't need to.
Yeah.
So tell us about that DVI experience. How was that?
Man, it was the best thing I ever did. And I remember telling my dad that I'm going to leave the hospital and I'm going to leave this, you know, little gig I had with Mallinckrodt, and I'm going to go full time with this company called DVI. And I telling him about my interview. And Paul Buckman, who's a great individual, you know him, he showed up in OP shorts and a polo shirt for the interview. And, you know, he was a California guy. And so I told my dad about that, and he said, he had a polo shirt on, and he's telling you you're going to make this money, and this is going to be a fantastic career. Can you trust him? Why didn't he have a suit on? You know, did he have a college ring on? You know, and no, Dad, I just there was something about him, and thank God I took the job. But I did not take the job initially. I took the job, and then I got cold feet, and I actually did not show up for training, believe it or not. Yeah, and I remember Paul calling me, Alan calling me, and said, "Hey." Melanie calling me and said, "You have to do this." And in 24 hours, I changed my mind, hopped on the plane, and then went out to training. But it's a little known fact, I did not go.
Why? So what was they thinking?
Trepidation, you know,
big step.
my dad was like, gosh, you got a great job. You know, you're making, 80 grand a year. What are you doing? You know, I had reached, bigger and more than I even imagined, and already being a technologist and working for Mallinckrodt, and more than he ever thought I would do, and, we just didn't have family members or friends that did this stuff.
Yeah.
So he was like, wow, you're making a mistake. Don't do that. I remember we were hanging up a ceiling fan in my new place I had bought. And he was like, what are you doing? And I actually had my first child as well. So, which I did early. I have 3 grandkids now. We can talk about that.
No, we will talk about that.
That's right. But, he was like, don't do this. And that's what kind of stopped me from doing it. But thank God I did. It turned out to be the best career move, but working with the most special people, Hank Plain, Jeff Close, Greg Cachero. I mean, the list is on, Brian Walsh. Just a whole host of people who are now CEOs and leaders in the medical device community. Corey Blevins, obviously Alan Will, Paul Buckman, Hank Plain. They developed me as a man, quite frankly, because I was very young, 22 years old at that time.
How long were you at DVA? Through the acquisition?
Through the acquisition, yeah.
And then what was next?
Yeah, so then Guidant was formed, ACS, Guidant, CPI, we all went there. And actually something very interesting happened. I was a regional manager. I had made it to a regional manager, had excelled in all the successes as a salesperson, rookie of the year, TM of the year, all the things.
Mm-hmm.
Grew the business. And I was a regional manager, and when that Guidant Corporation came together, there was an ACS manager in Washington, D.C. That's where I was living. And I was in Washington, D.C., and they had to combine one manager. That person had more tenure, and he got the job to do the regional manager job for the vascular intervention, and I was riffed from the company. And it was interesting. Dennis Antonori, who was the leader at the time, called me up, and George Conaway, and said, listen, you're riffed, but we want you to do something else. And that's when I was introduced to cardiac pacemakers. And I really had never done cardiac pacemakers. And I was terrified because the electrophysiology lab, I used to stay away from that when I was a technician, because they would look like mad scientist work going on. And so they convinced me to take the job. It was actually 3 of us from vascular that went over to the pacing side. And my new boss at that time said, you won't make it. You can't learn this. This is very technical stuff. If you don't have a history in it or you didn't grow up in it, there's no way you can make it as a pacemaker rep.
Yeah, bullshit. Okay. Just so at the time, right, so we've got to put this in context. You've gone from the emerging team to the established team.
Yeah.
So tell me more about that, right? So that's how you start off. You're not going to survive.
Yeah, you're not going to survive, right? So, expert in the vascular space, done it all, peripheral, coronaries, that's still emerging, stents were being, tried out at that time, but I'm then deviating to electrophysiology and pacing. And probably the hardest transition I had to make because of several reasons. They didn't tell me that they wanted me to do this job in Richmond, Virginia.
Yeah, let's talk about let's talk about that.
Because that was a cultural, mind-blowing shift. Grew up Washington, D.C., Baltimore. As you know, a lot of diversity there. And I find myself in Richmond, Virginia with a family, okay? And no one wanted me there, believe me. It was a very, very tough transition. I faced a lot of racism. I faced a lot of challenges. The Medtronic rep, who was an older rep, his son was like in the biggest practice there. Yeah. No one was using my product. I think the sales were in the hundreds of thousands, in millions and millions of dollars of business with pacemakers and defibrillators. And I literally was thrown into what I considered a failing situation. And I remember my manager at the time said, don't sell your house in Baltimore because you're probably not going to make it here in Richmond, and you're not going to make it through the training program. And my competitive self everything that I had done prior to that really gave me the confidence to go ahead and make it happen. And that pacemaker school class program was really tough, and I finished top of my class in that. Yep.
So yet again,
Yeah.
top of the class.
Yeah.
I was just smiling to myself is I don't think I've ever been top of
The class.
You nailed it twice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So how?
How?
How'd you do it?
How did I do it? I think part of it was the manager telling me I couldn't do it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that got me pretty fired up. As a matter of fact, I had called my previous leader, Dennis Antonori, who put me in the role, and said, "Hey, listen, this guy's not bought in. Prove him wrong." And I'm like, "Yeah, I want to prove him wrong." And Andrew, I'm very proud to say that not only did I get through it, I learned pacing, I learned defibrillation, I learned this procedure. And the first year I was in the business, I actually just got the picture that I'm going to show you after this. This was 1997, I think. Yeah, 1997. I was Rookie of the Year, took sales from hundreds of thousands the first year to 5.2 million the first year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I just fell in love with change, accomplishing something that I've never done before, being able to go into an environment and figure out how to get accepted. And you can imagine, these electrophysiologists didn't want to deal with an interventional cardiology guy. My reputation was on the street. Oh, he came from Washington Hospital Center and the cardiac cath lab. He wasn't part of the EP community, all those things.
Yep.
And that fueled me, and I just went to work. The one thing that I realized is that you can get comfortable when you have done a job for a while or you have an environment. And my Medtronic rep at the time got real comfortable. And I found ways to beat him because he was way too comfortable in his job.
Keep going.
Yeah.
How?
When? So maybe I'll give a couple examples how I got to him, and then kind of capstone it with how personally. Because, I saw this individual who was on top of the world, who had all of the ORs just write MDT in the slot,
Yep.
So the first thing I did was I figured out what he didn't like to do. And what he didn't like to do was pacemaker checks, defib checks, all that. So I learned his programmer, and I went to...
No way.
Yes. I went to a lot of the physicians, and I said, "Hey, listen, if you need a pacemaker checked, or you need somebody to go check a pacemaker in the ER on Saturdays, or the Medtronic team can't make it, call me. I know the programmer. I can check those patients for you and help you with these patients and get them through this." And lo and behold, something happened. One physician called me. 2 physicians called me. 3 physicians called me. And so I'm literally doing a bunch of work around him. He had no idea that was happening, building those relationships. And I started getting calls then to say, "You know what? Sam is here. He's helping us out. Well, let's give him a case. Let's give him a pacemaker. Let's give him a defib." And I remember when I got my first case from this physician, and it was a VVI pacemaker, thank God, because I hadn't had a lot of experience, because I'm just trying to survive. And it was an easy VVI pacemaker. And the physician asked me, he said, "How experienced are you in this?" I said, "Not very at all." And he said, "Appreciate the honesty." And all through that case, he counseled me in a way where he was teaching me and helping me become successful. And his name was Dr. Rosie Gillum, who is just one of the prolific African-American electrophysiologists in the space, and gave me my shot. And what was so interesting about that, he was in that big group, and he said, "I want to use Sam Conaway." And then it just started snowballing, because I was giving service, I was doing things, I was putting reports together that, my counterpart, he would do the case, leave the strips on the counter and leave. I was making these beautiful reports, following up on patients, just doing things extra to beat him, because I knew he had gotten lazy. Show up to the case with one lead, one pacemaker when that particular lead didn't fit the patient, and they had to go out into his car. And I remember Rosie, when he was teaching me, he says, never go to your car. If you have to go to your car, stay there. So I was always well prepared, and had, if we were doing a generate exchange, I knew everything about that patient for adapters and all these very integral things that were part of that procedure. So how did I do it? I did it by a strong work ethic, outworking him, working smarter, making sure I was clinically competent, really clinically competent, and making sure that I was in that environment in a way where I was an expert. And that's how I've really done everything since then.
I was going to say, everything up until then, and then everything since then, right?
That's
So that's
right.
how you've got this path. Well, that was quite a remarkable conversation. I hope you enjoyed learning more about Sam and how his drive, intelligence, and dedication made such an impression on some of the most influential cardiologists of our time that helped him propel his career to such heights. There's a lot more to uncover about Sam and how he is working to do something impactful, truly impactful, about inequities in healthcare. Be sure to subscribe to MedTech Trailblazers to learn more about him in the second episode of this series. Cheers.